Welcome to our fourth session of ETE 2021, Building a Successful Change Management Strategy, Accelerating User Adoption with our Elire Strategy Consultant, Stephen Kwiatkowski. A couple of reminders just for the session today. Everyone has been placed on mute. If you guys have any questions throughout, please submit them into the chat to panelists or in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time at the end for those. We also have one poll question in this presentation. That's just to help gauge where attendees are at with their change management strategy. So we encourage participation. This session also has a change management toolkit that will be sent out in the follow-ups as well for you to download. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Katie. So we're here today to talk about building a successful change management strategy. And really, the approach is something that's fairly universal. It doesn't matter whether it's a large technology project, whether it's a small change within your team. I'll talk about how you can make a strategy really work for your organization. The principles are fairly universal, and we'll talk through the steps and what you need to do. And then really it's just a matter about scaling some of these tasks up or down depending on what your project and team needs are. So we'll talk about what makes all of that successful. In terms of what to expect, I'll introduce myself in just a moment. We'll talk about the importance of change management, specifically for IT projects. We'll talk about defining and measuring change and how to do that, creating an action plan to really address what you've identified, managing the change throughout the course of your projects, and then really tracking adoption and why that's valuable. Elire was established in 2005. We're celebrating 16 years of business this year. Our big approach is helping our clients by being a trusted advisor and a partner. We really want people to implement and optimize their software investments, and optimization is really key. And one of the things we've found is that to really unlock the power of your software, oftentimes it's not just about development, it's not just about technical integrations. It's really about making sure that people are ready to use the software that you've put in place. It's making sure that the business process is clearly defined, it's repeatable, it has metrics, it's measurable. So often with our clients, the really key thing that's holding them back is the process and the people. And we'll talk about bringing all three of those things together at once, specifically on the change management side. I work in our management advisory services practice. So we help support both our technology practices, our treasury practice, of course. And our goal is really to help execute some of the more strategic projects as opposed to the technical projects. We do things like application roadmaps, helping our client partners decide, what's going to be the right treasury platform for me. I have these requirements. Is it Kyriba? Is it FIS? Is it Oracle? Is it something else entirely? Really laying out the pros and cons of each of those, making the right choice for application investment. I did highlight business process improvement and end user adoption because those are things that I think get kind of overlooked on a lot of technology projects. And really, we've found a lot of success with letting those considerations really help drive success in the projects, just as much as technical considerations. There's a picture of me, in case you can't see me on the camera. So again, I'm just a senior consultant with Elire in our management advisory services practice. And the benefit of really being in that management advisory services role is that I've been able to see a huge variety of projects. So like I alluded to right away in the beginning, this change management approach is for treasury projects, it's for ERP projects, it's for HCM projects, it's for internal process redesign. It can be used for anything. It's really up to you to scale it up and down to meet your needs. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of change management. So specifically, I always like to think about change management and how it fits into the overall approach for IT projects. And one of Elire's big things is making sure that people, process, and technology all kind of cross the finish line at the same time. So let's break that down just a little bit. Technology, I think, is super understandable for most people. You know that your requirements need to be comprehensive when you're selecting a technology partner. You need to know that the vendor offers a robust platform, that they have support and other service offerings, to really make sure that you aren't abandoned after you go live. And from a very project-specific perspective, you need to make sure your development and your configuration is all done, before you go live, obviously. Otherwise, what are you going to find? You're going to find you're doing manual work. You've just implemented a new technology tool, and yet you're still going to be doing things offline. That's the best case. The worst case is that you have defects, you're unable to dispatch payments, you're unable to set up new bank accounts, whatever it might be. And that's unacceptable enterprise risk. So how do you address that type of risk? How do you get the technology across the finish line and make sure that those items are accounted for? Testing, of course. You need to have a robust test plan. You need to have a robust set of testers testing all of your different transactions. And you need to make sure that your testing environments mimic production. On the process side, again, in order to use a new technology tool to its full effect, you really need to make sure that your business process needs to be clearly defined. You need to have your roles and responsibilities laid out, who's doing what. You need to make sure there are appropriate checkpoints, audit points, visibility into the status of things. Otherwise, what are you going to find? You'll find manual workarounds. You'll find ad hoc firefighting if your process isn't clearly defined. Inconsistency, which is going to really eat into the ROI of this technology tool in the first place. And just limiting really the benefits of the tool if you don't have consistent processes in place to use it. So how do you mitigate some of that risk? Just having a comprehensive and robust future state process design. Lay out everything that you want your tool to do, whether that's your bank relationship management, your payment processing, your bank statement processing, whatever it might be. Make that list of everything that your application needs to do. Make that list of roles and responsibilities within the business process, and lay out that future state design so that you have the confidence that your tool is going to work for you. And finally, the thing that we're going to focus the most on today is the people. The staff really needs to understand what the tool is. Beyond just understanding what it is and how it works, you need to have desire, the desire to change, the desire to use the tool to its full functionality, the desire to do things in a different way. And finally, there's the third piece, which is skill. You could have a gung-ho team who is ready to go. And if they haven't had sufficient training, if your vendor partner hasn't done a good enough job of teaching you how to support the tool after they leave, you're going to run into unacceptable risk. So, addressing the people side of these projects is something that personally I think gets overlooked, but it really can be valuable in making sure that you're getting the full value out of your investments. And how do you ensure that on the people side? You ensure that through change management throughout the course of the project. So like I've said a few times, our change management approach is really to support all kinds of software implementation, optimization, business process changes, organizational changes. The key is really using training, communication, and change behavior modeling to maximize the value of your software investment. It's not going to replace having a robust platform. It's going to make using that robust platform that much more effective when you go live. So the first step is really about defining and measuring what's changing. So like I said, one of our first steps on basically any project is mobilization. We want to make sure that there's an appropriate project governance in place. We want to make sure that we have the right resources, the right people, all in place, all identified. And one of the ways that we lay out what's going to be in scope is a RACI document. So that's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. And really laying out what modules are in scope, what business processes you're addressing, and then who's responsible for each of them. On my projects, I use a RACI from day one, basically all the way through go live. And I'll talk about when we use the RACI in support of the change management tasks. Identifying resources. A lot of treasury teams can be very small, tight-knit groups. In that case, you may not need to lay out specifically who's doing what. But if you have groups that are spread out across the US or across the world, it can be helpful to have kind of that breakdown of who's doing what for every group, who's going to be impacted by every change to each of these modules or processes. One of the things we like to do on our larger projects typically is conducting a listening tour or a survey. Again, this is from the consultant perspective where we're coming in, we're trying to learn about our client, understand what the preferred communication method or approach is. For your internal teams, you may already know what the best methods of communication, the best methods of training are, especially if it's a very tight-knit team. You may already have that information in front of you, which is great. Basically, what you're trying to do is establish what's going to be the best training modality. Does one team work better when they're just given the resources and left to their own devices? Does one different team work better if they are in a training lab and they're walked through it by an implementation team? How are people going to best absorb the content and the information? Same kind of thing with communication, right? If you're sending out emails and you know that in your organization, emails get ignored, but your weekly team meetings are a better way for people to get information. That's what you want to establish right up front with some of these projects. And then finally, this one can be hard to gauge, but you basically want to try to get a baseline readiness for change. Identifying if there are people within your organization that are going to be resistant to change, identifying if there are people who are going to be very ready and would maybe be a good change champion. Figuring out who those people are and what their attitudes are early is absolutely critical to having a successful change management strategy for any project. Identifying what the obstacles are, as well as who the champions are, is really going to set you off on the right foot. This next one, reviewing existing materials. Typically, again, that's from a consulting perspective. We want to know if there is existing training materials, existing job aids, existing branding, things like that. For your next technology project, you want to make sure that it's consistent with what people are used to, if it's been effective. And if those things don't exist, then maybe you should be asking yourself, well, if we're implementing a substantial change in our treasury department, maybe we need to build some training materials. Maybe desk side by side is not the best way to onboard new resources. Let's put some documentation together while we're doing the project because we'll have the subject matter experts there. And then finally, when we're mobilizing, we try to complete a change impact assessment, which I'll get into on the next slide. Sorry, 2 slides. The RACI, again, is laying out who's responsible for what. And so this is a great way to frame out, what does your project look like? Is it cash management? Is it deal management? Is it, a full treasury suite? Is it one single process? Laying out who's responsible, who's accountable, who's doing the work, who's approving it. If you have upstream or downstream partners that need to be engaged, the RACI is definitely the key there. And even beyond just setting your project scope, I find it extremely useful whenever we're setting up project communications, whenever we're deciding, wait, who needs to be in this meeting? I am always referring back to my RACI, and I would encourage all of you to do the same. The change impact assessment. So I alluded to this slide or 2 ago. So essentially what you're trying to do here is determine, okay, I have my list of modules. I have my list of business processes. I know who's engaged. Now, how do I tell how much is changing? If you're going from a completely manual process to like a treasury suite, for example, you know that most things are going to be changing. And so it's helpful to break it out between, are there systematic impacts? Are we building integrations to upstream or downstream applications like an ERP? And then are there people impacts? Is somebody's job role going to be completely redefined because there's a new treasury platform to work off of? And that's really what the change impact assessment is trying to do, is take a systematic approach to identify what the future state is going to look like. And even just at a low, medium, high type level, identify where the most change is going to be. So this is what we do. This is an example from an HCM project that we did. And basically you just lay out, by business process, it's the what's changing, how much, and then who's it affecting. So, it can be helpful just to say, well, we have, completely manual processes and they're going completely digital. Well, that's going to be a lot of change. And we know that it affects the core team. Maybe you have upstream or downstream partners that will be affected, but they're not really going to be affected as much. That would be a lower change score. But essentially, you want to take a systematic approach so that you can understand where to spend the majority of your time in configuration, in design, as well as in project communications and in training. Our approach is typically to collect this impact score via workshops and surveys that compare the future state to the current state. If we're doing an implementation project or kind of a new technology project, oftentimes our implementation partner is a great place to start because they've done it before and they know, from experience, what's going to be the most impactful to your people. But really, it's the systematic approach that's what's most important. That's how you make sure that you're covering your bases. That's how you make sure that you're taking the approach step by step. The other thing to note about the who is impacted, we like to break out a heavy user or like a core user and a light user. Because oftentimes the training or change management or communication approach is going to differ based on whether they're part of your core team or whether they're somewhere downstream or just impacted. You want more engaging, more comprehensive, more robust training for your core team, of course. But you don't want to forget about other users who might be impacted. And you can always keep them in the loop with project communications, project updates. And even if it's simpler training, just publishing a job aid, publishing a guide for the most common types of situations that they're going to run into. One of the other things we will occasionally do, depending on the magnitude of the project, the size of the change, is look at the impacted job roles. This is kind of a subset or a variation of the change impact assessment. But basically, instead of by tracking by module or department, pivot by person. So if you do have a very small team where people wear a lot of hats, you can kind of use that by role or by individual even, and try to determine what's changing for an individual. From there, it's helpful to kind of redefine what their job description is going to look like. And this is, again, from more of an organizational perspective. You may need to update what that job attributes are. If your treasury analyst is completely redefining what their role looks like because of the new tool that's out there, it's always helpful to circle back with your HR organization and make sure that that's reflected. One of the other things I alluded to a little earlier was identifying roles with high turnover. So essentially, if you have a core team that's been there forever, that's going to be a part of the project, they'll get their training on the project and they'll know how to use the application or tool or technology that you're implementing. If there's a role that has a lot higher turnover, if there are new employees constantly, if there are more junior roles or something like that, they're not going to get that same impact out of just, well, I was part of the implementation project, so I know. If you can identify some of those roles, it can be very helpful to have training specific to those more junior roles because you're expecting them to turn over. So use the time during your technology project to identify, well, is the core team going to be the only ones using the application? Or if there are other people that are going to be using it more casually, building up that library, if you will, it can be critical because you'll have all the subject matter experts engaged at the time of your project. So let's kind of reassess. We've had our listening tour, or we've connected with our team, depending on the size of your team. We know how are we going to communicate? How are we going to share project status updates? We have our readiness. Is anybody going to be an obstacle? Is anybody really a champion of this new product or change? We've looked at our existing materials. We've built out our job and change impact assessment to say, okay, this is where we think the most change is going to happen. And so you've got all of your background data points, and this is really where we start to develop a change management strategy. And the strategy is really your action plan. So that's what we're getting into. So we like to take kind of a three-pronged approach to change. And we found it to be very useful. Depending on the size of your organization or the size of your project, you may be able to pare down some of these things. But the first fork of the trident, if you will, is the communication approach. So identifying how are we going to give project updates? How are we going to let people outside of the project team know, what's changing? Is there an impact to their job? Is there an impact to their business process? How do we share these messages? The second thing is the change approach. So that's really about how do people adopt the new business process? We like to use change champions if you have a large team. And specifically, those are going to be stakeholders or managers who people trust. They're the ones who you'll want to go to first, and they're the ones that their peers will go to as well if they have questions or concerns about the change. So utilizing change champions can be effective if there's a large team. If it's a very small, tight-knit team, usually it's not as necessary. Finally, defining metrics is definitely key. Deciding how do we know that this was successful? That can be an incredibly effective way to make sure that your change is actually effective. The only way to really be able to tell is to measure it. And finally, we have a training approach. So we use kind of a philosophy called the 5 moments of need, as well as depending on the size of your organization, the size of the change, that's when you might start to consider, well, do we need to work with our LMS team? Do we work with our vendor? Does our vendor provide training as part of their implementation or their project? Do we need to build training materials internally? And that's when you can start to have some of those conversations and decide on the overall approach. How are you going to deliver training? So again, you've got your baseline information that you've collected. And then all of this feeds into, okay, how are we going to train people? Do we have materials? Do we need to build materials? How are we going to encourage people to adopt the change? Do we have engagement from influential sponsors and stakeholders? Do people feel like they understand the reason for it? Are they ready to try the new way? And then a communication approach. How do we share project milestones and updates? How do we make sure that people are ready for when we cut over? So the 5 moments of need, this is, again, how we approach most of our communications. And the idea here is that there are 5 different times that an individual is going to approach content, 5 different times in slightly different ways that they will absorb it. So the first moment of need is when they learn something new. So this might be a project communication. We're implementing a treasury platform. And so we really just need to meet that immediate need of what are we doing at the highest level? What does it look like? What's a treasury platform? How's that going to work? The second moment of need is learning more about it. And so that's really learning how the pieces and parts all fit together. So not just we have a new platform, but these are the modules, these are the processes, these are where we're integrating to. It's really all of the background information. The third moment of need is in applying what you learned. So many adults learn best when they are learning by doing, if you will. The adult learning model focuses on that as opposed to kind of the youth learning model, which a lot of times you can have more dictation and things like that. With adults, you really want to apply concepts on the job. And so here you can have communications, trainings, milestones within your project to say, let's make sure key people are getting engaged. They're involved in testing. They know where to find resources when they're actually executing the work. The fourth moment of need, or the fourth time that people will actually be looking for change management support, is when things go wrong. So you need to have materials or the process in place to say, okay, if you are unable to execute a transaction, what do you do? Is this something that you can troubleshoot yourself? Do you need to open a support ticket with your vendor? Or is there online help that your vendor has offered? Do you have another subject matter expert within your team? Define what that approach is and then build those materials in place for when things go wrong. And then finally, when things change. So if you're on like one of the newer cloud platforms and there are new releases and there are new patches and there are new features and things like that, you need to have an approach in place for how are you communicating that to both your internal staff as well as, again, some of those external parties that may be impacted. So it's not enough just to do your project communications. You should have an approach in place for, if there are patches, if there are enhancements, making sure that managers know what's coming down the pipeline.
Thanks, Stephen. So I'm launching our first poll question. It's going to be, what kind of communication methods does your organization use? You're able to select multiple here. So executive messages, videos and updates, manager information cascade, stand-up or huddle meetings, newsletters or weekly emails, forum post, webinars, or maybe another method. I'll give about 20 seconds to reply. Looks like votes are still coming in, so I'll give another second or two. I'm going to go ahead and close it out, so make sure to submit what you have. And Stephen, it looks like there's a pretty good mix, but the top three are newsletters, weekly emails, executive messages, as well as a manager information cascade.
Great, thanks, Katie. So what this tells me is just that there's definitely value in understanding how your own organization works best before developing your communication approach. If the information is best shared in kind of a manager cascade, in one-on-one meetings and team meetings and things like that, that's going to affect your messaging a lot more than if it comes from an email. A lot of people do use email. A lot of people find email successful. Some people get so overwhelmed with email that it's ineffective after a while. So really deciding on what's going to work best for your organization is kind of the whole point of taking the listening tour, taking a look at your own internal culture, and looking at what has worked best in your previous projects. And so I would encourage everybody, if you're undertaking a large change, to think about some of these other communication modalities, because sometimes it can be effective to mix it up. If you have key project milestones, get an executive message up there. If you have just weekly status reports, sure, that can be kept in an email. But by keeping the messaging diverse, as well as tailored to your audience, you're going to get a lot better engagement. So that's kind of the planning or the discovery, right? You've gotten a feel for your organization, you've built out what you expect to change, and you have your approach in mind. So based on that baseline information, our next step is to build out a communication matrix. And the communication matrix is really the calendar, if you will, of project communications. You want to make sure that the message is sent to people at the right time. And that could include things like executive messages, that could include team meetings, it could include specific emails that you plan to send. We include all of those when we're building out our communication calendar. But basically, we want to know what's the communication, why are we trying to send it, who's the audience, what's the specific content that needs to be written, who's it going to come from, and then is there any call to action? Is there something that people need to do, or is it just an FYI? But really laying that out, especially in line with the project calendar, is really, really effective for making sure that your communications are ongoing, you're very high touch, and that you're tracking that people actually know what's going on with the project. And that's just another thing that I would like to reiterate, is that we start with communication at project mobilization, and it continues even after go live through stabilization, especially if you're on a product where you're doing a staggered go live. If you are implementing in one region first and then another region later, keeping that communication, keeping everybody in the loop is definitely critical. And the matrix is the way to track that. So you've got your communications all laid out for the project. The other item that we typically produce is a training curriculum. So we come up with a list of what are the required training materials that we're going to need, what content is going to be in each. Is there anything internally? Do we have an LMS application? Do we have an internal training development team? Is our vendor providing all of this for us? Is this something we have to build ourselves? Lay out that plan with the specific items, estimated time, what's the modality, kind of build that out, including things like your corporate communication template. If you have branding, because there are, a job aid templates or things like that. That's the next thing that you want to build out, is really the list of, okay, are we doing bank statement training? Are we doing payment training? Or is it just one single module? Do we even need training materials because it's all embedded? But laying out the list can be extremely effective to make sure that you are finding the right balance between giving people support resources and then not overdoing it. So you've got your baseline information, you've laid out your plan, you've built out your matrices for exactly what communications are we sending when, what training materials do we need to build, and now it's all about managing change throughout the life cycle of the project. So we call this our development phase. So in line with the development of actual functionality within your tool, we build out the training and communication materials. Typically, we have a multiple step kind of process where we have agreed, yep, these are the training materials that need to be in place. We've written them up. We've done a rough draft. We do an internal quality review. Then we'll walk through and get manager approval. Like I said, a lot of this is very much from the consultative perspective. So if you have a smaller team, you may be able to skip over some of these steps. But really, this is when you want to build it out and have a repeatable process for even building out your communications. Knowing who's going to send it, knowing who's going to write it, and knowing when it needs to be sent is all critical to ensuring that buy-in. Really, this is the individual pieces of content. You might get executive messages recorded. You might build out an LMS course. You might be able to just confirm with your vendor if they have training materials that they have everything on the list. Oftentimes on our large projects, we've brought in specific training developers. We'll have one person from the project team lay out what exactly is needed and then build in one specific resource to develop that training material. Depending on the size of your team or your organization or your project, that may not be necessary, but sometimes it can be helpful, especially if you are very much a treasury team and not a design team. Use people who have those design skills. And then one of the things that we always try to do is finish our training materials before the end of before the start, of user acceptance testing, because that lets us make user acceptance testing not just testing the application, but it makes sure that we're able to test our training and communication materials too. If there's content in the training materials that don't actually make sense, if they were based on an old version of the design, if there's missing content, whatever it might be, you can figure all of that out in user acceptance testing, and then update your training materials so that they can be ready for go live, ready for the broader audience, ready for turnover, ready for new staff, etc. So that's the build, that's building everything based on what you laid out in your planning and design phase. The next step is really delivering. You want to make sure that training and communications are delivered to support your project milestones. So if you have your communications matrix laid out, it's very easy. You know exactly what's coming up in the upcoming weeks. You have target send dates. You can draft your communications, go through the approval process, and then as you send out each of those items, mark them off. Just run down your checklist, essentially. Same thing with the training curriculum. Once you have that list of everything that's needed, you can start to build it, whether that's with a designer, whether that's with your vendor, whether that's in-house, and really just run through building all of that material and then posting it so that people can actually take it, learn from it. When you talk about delivering training, we found there are a couple different methods that work very well, especially for these types of technology projects. Depending on the complexity, a learning management system can be useful or helpful. If you have like an in-house training development team, I'd usually lean away from having a small treasury team try to build an entire LMS course. It's just not necessary. If you have skilled resources who are good at training design and training development, building an LMS course can be very engaging. It can be long-lived. You can use it for new hires and new resources. Individual delivery is kind of the old standby. Point people to the help resources online, build your job aids and send them out and kind of hope people read them. Let people do kind of self-directed training based on the materials that are posted. That's kind of mixed success. That depends on how engaged your team and your staff are. You need to make sure that they know where to find the materials, that they are engaging with it, they're reading it, they're learning. Finally, instructor-led training. Instructor-led training can be extremely useful, especially for small project teams. If you have a consultant or a vendor partner who is already a subject matter expert in whatever your technology project is, you can kind of learn quite a bit on the job. So just making sure that that's laid out in the beginning of your project, that's going to be your approach. Instructor-led training, learning directly from the vendor, for example, can be extremely effective. So you've planned it all out. You've written your training and communications. You've sent them all out. And now you're wondering, well, how do we actually track adoption? This is one of the reasons that we like to do our training pre-UAT, because during UAT, you have a lot more control about, well, are people actually ready from both a technology skills as well as process skills perspective. During UAT, you can do evaluations of your training materials as well as of the overall application. If you're doing test labs in UAT, you have everybody in one place. You can confirm with them, was the training effective? Was it useful? Did you know where to find it? You can also do trainer feedback sessions. If you're having kind of side-by-side or instructor-led training, you can get the feedback directly from that teacher, if you will. Tracking end user progress can actually be fairly difficult if you're not using a learning management system. A lot of times people just let their employees access the training materials, you publish them, but really keeping on top of have people completed it? Have they been able to access it? That's kind of critical and kind of key. And so that's really difficult to do unless you have built metrics in place up front. Some of the other things you can do, even if you aren't tracking, well, did so-and-so read this training guide that I built, you can at least focus on success metrics. If you have specific key transactions, if you have, I guess, baseline transactions, how long did it take us to process XYZ beforehand? How long is it taking us now? training or not, you can kind of get a rough sense of if people are learning to use the tool, as well as seeing some of that time to value materialize. Oftentimes with a change, even just keeping the same amount of time right at UAT or go live is to be expected, and you don't really see the skills built until several weeks or months of actually using the new tool. And that's when you'll start to see those efficiencies come into play. You can also do internal survey results, again, depending how large your team is. If we're doing a large ERP project, we will do surveys to see how people are feeling about the training, the application as a whole. Is there anything missing, etc. And if you do that at multiple points throughout your project, then you can kind of see the trend over time from baseline. How did people feel about it to, okay, we're at UAT, we're about to go live. Are people satisfied? And even post UAT, post go live, send out a third survey to get employee confidence in the tool. And finally, support. So it's, like I said, it can be very enticing to fall into the idea that the project team is going to be able to learn on the job. They'll just learn as part of the project, and then we don't need to do any of these training materials because it's all, they know it already. One of the things that we hear often is that even with these new applications, things are constantly changing. There are always new patches, there are new features, there are new things coming out, and sometimes the teams change. You might be adding to your team, there is turnover. So having the approach in place for how are you going to update your training materials, that's something that we like to do during the project. Being forward-looking and basically saying, is there a help desk that we need to train? Do we need like FAQ documents for them? Are we just going to build our own internal training materials? Who's going to update those if a new patch comes out? Laying out that strategy during the project is extremely effective because then you're not caught scrambling, weeks or months later. So again, this is kind of the end-to-end approach that we like to use for change management. And I think it's fairly straightforward. It's fairly self-explanatory, because really it's just relying on best practices of project management. It's mobilizing, it's defining scope, it's building out what individual items you need. It's using the tools that are out there. It's making sure that people are taking the training that they need to. And then it's staying forward-looking and accounting for change because change is constant. So that's really what we have for building that change management strategy, for being thoughtful about it, for doing it as part of your project. And I think there are a couple of items.
Yeah, Stephen, I can take it from here.
Yep.
So the up next session, I'm going to drop the link here in the chat in just a second, but it's a LIBOR to C4 conversion, which is your organization prepared? And this is going to be presented by our Elire Treasury Advisory Services Practice Lead, Sudeep Sharma. And this session is available for CTP credits. So if that's something you guys are interested in, feel free to join that. And Stephen, it looks like we did have 3 questions come through. So we can go right into the Q&A. The first one is, what if I'm unsure on how my team learns best?
Well, the best thing to do is ask them. Honestly, the amount of project snafus that can be avoided just by clear lines of communication is unbelievable sometimes. If your organization hasn't had these kind of training initiatives in the past, sometimes it can be useful to pilot things out. You don't need to build the full training approach completely right away at the beginning. Try a few job aids, try a few learning management courses, try instructor-led training throughout the life of the project. If you have your vendor helping you define or configure things within your tool, really you have a lot of flexibility to see what your team likes, what works and what doesn't work. So I would do that over the life cycle of the project if you don't have that knowledge up front.
Perfect. And the next question is, how often do you recommend reviewing training materials?
Honestly, it doesn't need to be done too often. It needs to be done when there's an expected change. So if there's a substantial change to a fundamental functionality, I'm just going to use patching. If there's a patch that comes out annually, if there's some kind of tax update, I'll use the ERP example. Annual tax updates for the ERP don't typically need additional training. You don't need to review your training materials. You don't need to update them. What really matters is when there are changes to the underlying functionality or the underlying business process. That's when you want to take a second, look at the training materials that you've built and see if they need to be fundamentally updated. So really, it depends on what the driver of the change is. If nothing's changed for years, I mean, sure, you could do a review once a year and just check on what you have. What I would typically do, though, is wait until you're hiring somebody new, because there's nothing more frustrating as a new employee than getting training materials that are out of date. If they're years old and they're still effective, great. But if you are, just trying to do a routine update, I would lean more towards wait and see what's changing in the business process, wait and see if there's a fundamental change in your tool or application, or wait and see if you have new staff coming on, and then do your review at that point.
Thanks, Stephen. And one last one I'm seeing is, if we don't have any instructional designers or a training department, who should be owning the training materials and their management?
It's a great question. Oftentimes it will be the project team. I always tend to defer to the manager in whatever, let's say the treasury manager, for example, shouldn't be the one producing the training materials. Oftentimes the people who are doing the work are much better suited to taking appropriate screenshots, writing up the process narrative, giving the examples of what data to use and when and why, and then elevating the manager to that approval role. So if you don't have a training design team, if you don't have an LMS team or anything like that, it can fall on your team to build these materials. And that can feel like overhead sometimes, which is frustrating. But really the benefit is when you look to the long term. If you have a couple of core project team members and then substantially larger team members outside of the core project team that need this training, there's going to be substantial time savings by having somebody who knows the material well write it up right away in the beginning. So I think it really falls on the subject matter experts, but overseen from my perspective, overseen by like a change management consultant. That's why people bring us onto these types of projects, is to make sure that we can offload some of that work from the project team while still leveraging their expertise.
Great. Thanks, Stephen, for getting those answered. Those look like there's no more questions that have been submitted. Just as I'm wrapping it up here, Stephen and I can stay on for an extra minute or two after this is done if you guys think of any more lingering questions. But we just want to thank you guys so much for joining us. And just another reminder to follow us on our social media platforms, as well as just engage in the hashtag ETE 2021 on Twitter and LinkedIn. And this, you can get entered in one of our mini drawings for Elire swag or gift cards throughout the event. And once again, we do have one more session happening today and then a full day tomorrow. So we hope to see you guys once again. Thanks for your time.